Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our Saturday conversation this year. It's actually the first Saturday conversation of the new year because we had a service last week. So I'm delighted to welcome Wendy Cracknell, who is part of the congregation at St Mary's Church in Fordingbridge. And I'm particularly delighted because our conversation began when we had a chat about Desmond Tutu, who died recently. And that was what the sort of spark was for having this Saturday conversation. So warm welcome, Wendy. Nice to have you with us this morning. And do you want to say a little bit about your background in South Africa and how it was you got the connection?
I was born and bred in South Africa. My family had been there for many, many years, but all my grandparents were born there. My main connection with the church came through going to the diocesan school in Johannesburg, and through the nuns, and later a lot of the English staff became much more connected with the Anglican Church in South Africa and much more aware of what they were doing, and therefore much more aware of the problems, which as a child you take things for granted, but as you get older and you start realizing things aren't as they should be.
Yeah. What was it like being at the school? Was there any awareness of sort of racial tension or division?
There was always, although each house in the school had a charity and they were all related to black. Ours was a nursery school in Alexandra Township, and we used to send a bag of oranges every week. We used to knit blankets, and we were taken at one stage to meet them. You weren't allowed to go into townships when you were white. But we were taken in our final year to meet the children. And it's something you become increasingly aware of, that although you have black servants and you see them around, you don't really have they are kept separate.
Yeah.
Well, separate development, of course. It was too much separate and not enough development.
Well, yes, yeah.
And you know, going on, when I was at university, of course, you learn a lot more. And I became increasingly uncomfortable with the situation.
What did you study?
History.
History. I thought you were going to say that, yeah.
Yes. And I came to England to continue some postgraduate study. And I know one of my uncles said to my aunt leaving the airport, she won't come back. And of course I didn't. I married here. Oddly enough, someone I'd met in South Africa, but he was English. And I've lived here ever since, but obviously, particularly as an historian, continued to take a great interest. Now, I think Archbishop Tutu at that stage was only really in the earlier stages of his career as an anti-apartheid priest. He was never a member of the ANC and was always against violence, which was, I think, something that set certainly a lot of the people I knew against the ANC, that was their use of violence. And I've been wondering, reading about him in more detail recently, I think his position as a churchman was very important because it gave him a certain protection in a way. But also he was, of course, a Tswana and grew up in the Transvaal, whereas the ANC, the big split was always between the Xhosa in the Cape and the Zulu in Natal. And he was neither, really.
Right.
And therefore was able to take a position between them. And I think, again, well, even today, those tensions tear the ANC apart.
Yeah.
But,
and the Anglican Church, of course, ministered both to white and to black communities and coloured communities as well, didn't it?
Yes.
And Desmond Tutu was influenced by Trevor Huddleston.
Very much so. Very much so. Both
and all of that tradition.
And later on. And of course, I was much more aware of Trevor Huddleston when I was growing up than Bishop Tutu. But I remember the reaction among certain of my family when he first became Dean and then Bishop of Johannesburg, which is where most of my family are. And yet he never seemed to attract the disapproval that a lot of other people who were fighting apartheid did. It was always felt that he did so very much as a man of faith, and that it was a deeply held belief. And therefore, I've always felt he was one of those rare people you get in history who have the faith and the courage to speak truth to power.
Yeah.
And he did that throughout his life.
Yeah.
Both in the apartheid period, and then even more recently, when he found the ANC were not living up to his hopes for them.
He also led the remarkable Truth and Reconciliation Commission, didn't he?
Which
is so significant in the life of the country and in terms of healing.
Yes, apparently it was something he found incredibly traumatic, as you can imagine, having to hear what had gone on. But he was, I think, one of the very few people who could actually bridge that divide.
Yes.
You know.
But something about his personality, that he was able to talk to everybody, white or black, rich or poor. And although obviously clearly you're right, he was speaking the truth to power, but he still was able to love people, even though he deeply disagreed with their politics and so on. And that at that particular time seems to have worked, doesn't it?
Yes. I found a quotation from his which really appealed to me, both for what it said about him and something that we could all take on board for this time. He said, "Our maturity will be judged by how well we're able to agree to disagree and yet continue to love one another."
Yeah. Yeah. Cool.
I had contact with a cousin of mine who was a priest in South Africa. He was warden and then dean of St. Paul's Theological College in Grahamstown. And obviously, at that position, got to know the Archbishop extremely well, because he used to visit to see the students and obviously preparing for ordination.
And your cousin's now retired and living in this country, isn't he?
Yes. He lives in Bolton. But he said, when in the 80s, Archbishop Tutu arrived, the phone didn't stop ringing, and he was in contact with people all over the world. It was just after he'd won his Nobel Prize, but he had a stupendous memory, apparently, and visited. He remembered people, and he stopped to talk to people. He would talk to a waitress in a hotel, and asking about their situations, how they were. And afterwards, he would make contact, send something. He visited clergy in hospital regularly. He came out of synod one day and found a little boy sitting waiting for his father, who was in there, and sitting there bored and hungry. And he ordered a meal and sat and had a meal with them. He spoke to everybody. And I think he had such charm and such humor, as well as very deep faith. He got up at 5 o'clock in the morning to pray, and he would preach in the cathedral at Grahamstown, apparently, and it would be packed, and some people came to shut him down and others to listen. And by the end, he spoke about the love of God. And even his critics left saying, well, he can't be that bad.
Yeah.
We tend to forget that the nationalists in South Africa were Christian, their own variety, which I think a lot of people would feel isn't very Christian. But
so that came from the Dutch Reform tradition, didn't it?
But
was sort of shaped into a particular South African form of Christianity, which led to apartheid and supported apartheid, didn't it?
Yes, and they'd seceded from the African Council of Churches, which Bishop Tutu was General Secretary of. But they still recognised a Christian priest, as a someone you couldn't attack when he himself was anti-violence and preached love. And I think that made a big difference. And I think he was able, therefore, to bring people together from both sides.
Yeah.
He was a great friend, of course, of Nelson Mandela.
I was just thinking about him as well. It was remarkable that these two people came at the same time in South African history. I think, perhaps even the same time as Big Botha as well. That's, you know, that they happened to be there together. There was something about that.
I went to South Africa. I hadn't been for some years, and I went out in 1994 in March, the month before the first elections for universal suffrage. And I hadn't been for 10 years, and I was absolutely astounded. I could not believe the change that I found in my family and everybody I met. The change in attitude, the acceptance that this was going to happen, and it was a good thing. I'd always been afraid of a bloodbath. Obviously, that's what I had all my family. And everybody suddenly, over those few years, and I think a lot of it was due to Bishop Tutu, coming to realize that they couldn't go on that way, that there was a different way, and it didn't have to be a bad way. And a lot of what he did, I think, led to that acceptance. And when Mandela, who'd gone through some sort of political conversion while he was a prisoner, I think, because he was a man who was in prison for violent crime. And everybody thought of him as the man, one of the gang who were going to blow up the Rivonia Railway. That he'd gone through, again, some sort of conversion, that violence was not the way, that we had to accept and work together.
There was something remarkable about those years. There was the fall of the Berlin Wall, which I was, you know, that was my sort of area of interest really, and then change in South Africa, the Good Friday Agreement, and all of these intractable situations, as it seemed, they seemed like permanent situations of conflict, were able to be changed by these in different ways, actually, different processes in each of those three. But the South African one was particularly around people, wasn't it? People like Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, and some really key leaders who were able to show people that what was happening was wrong and there needed to be a new way.
Yes. They just couldn't go on the way they were. And I must admit, I was hugely delighted by the change that I saw. It meant a great deal to me. And I had great hopes, as I think Archbishop Tutu did, that the new ANC government would show the way forward, because South Africa was very much the leading light in economic terms in South Africa, in development terms. And there was so much that they could do.
It's such a shame that it's not always fulfilled its the hopes, has it? The ANC hasn't done that.
No, it hasn't. Apparently, according to my cousin, when in 1992, when voting was allowed, a lot of the students wanted to become members of a political party, and Bishop Tutu said no. He didn't want them to join political parties. A lot of the students were black, they wanted to join the ANC, and he said no, he wanted the clergy to be able to minister across the divides and to remain safe. I'm quoting that. And given that there was almost civil war between the Zulu, KZN and the ANC in Inkatha movement, he wanted, again, the clergy to be a bridge, I think. And I think that was very much his way. But of course, he did it with such charm and such humour and such love for everyone. I think that's what, for me, shines out of everything he did.
Mm.
And he just, well, as Chich says, in retirement, he was available to and an inspiration to his successors. The Archbishop, present Archbishop Makoba, had said this to Chich, who'd been a student at St. Paul's, and he said that Tutu was such an inspiration to him. And he is now, well, we've seen the pictures of him interring the ashes behind the pulpit in St. George's.
Yeah.
Which it reminded me of some of our family history on my father's side. One of my great-grandfather, I think, was one of the founders of St. George's Cathedral in Cape Town.
Gosh. Yes, I know you've got quite a family background of clergy in South Africa, haven't you?
Yes, on that side, very much. So my father's side, not the other side. My father's mother actually was Afrikaans, but basically of Huguenot stock originally, and her family had been out there since 1688. So it goes back a long way. But so I have all sorts of connections in South Africa going back a very long way.
But I think you're pretty settled here now, aren't you?
Very much so.
Thoughts of going back. No. Well, that's been really interesting, Wendy. Thank you for sharing that. And from your historian standpoint as well, as we reflect on Desmond Tutu and his life, has been really good. Yes. And we're going to finish with a clip that you've sent. And do you want to say why you thought it was so good?
Well, I think it just shows very much that his charm, his humour, and that he laughed at himself. He was never a man to set himself up to be important. He could laugh at himself, which I think is a great gift. And I must admit, I love the stories of his last days. He died on Boxing Day, but he received communion at Christmas, and he died with his wife of very many years, beside him on the bed and his family around him. I mean, what better death for a great man. And he will be greatly missed.
He will. Well, thank you. That's been really good conversation this morning. So you bring your historian's perspective at all, which is great. And so we'll play you out with the final joke from Desmond Tutu. Wish you all very well. We'll be on tomorrow at 10 o'clock, of course, as usual. And then every day next week, morning prayer on Monday and thoughts for the day, Tuesday to Friday, and another conversation next Saturday. Bye. Have a good day. Bye-bye, everyone.
You remember the one about the Archbishop? He dies and he goes to heaven, where he thinks he should be going. But when he gets there, St. Peter says, Miriam, you don't belong here. You've got to go to the other place. So I go to the other place, the warmer place. And 2 weeks later, there is frenzied knocking on the doors of heaven. And St. Peter goes and he opens, and there's the devil standing on the doorstep. And Peter says, no, Tuyo, what are you doing here? And the devil says, you sent Bishop Tutu down there. He's causing so much trouble. I've come to ask for political asylum.